Sound check 1, sound check 2. Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the overview of the EOP planning process webinar. My name is Cynthia Arredondo, and I once again have the privilege to serve as your host for this webinar. This afternoon, your presenters are Laura Stone and Tom Kelly, both school safety specialists at the Texas School Safety Center. Both Laura and Tom delivered the first part of the first course for the EOP series, and they both did a phenomenal job. And we're really looking forward to having them address the overview of the EOP planning process this afternoon with you. Before we begin, we'd like to go over some of the basic ground rules that we discussed last week. The first one is that the chat feature is located at the bottom right corner of your screen. Should you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter your question in the chat box. And if we're able to address your question right away, we will certainly do so. If not, we will address your question later on during the Q&A planning portion of the webinar. As I mentioned, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and this will be a great opportunity to ask any questions that you may have of the speakers. Thank you and enjoy, and at this time I will turn it over to Ms. Laura Stone.
So today, our webinar, we have a couple of objectives and outcomes that we'd like to set out forth with you at the beginning. First of all, we want to make sure that by the end of our presentation today that you understand the key planning principles that are utilized in creating a multi-hazard EOP. We also want to make sure that you're able to identify the components in the K-12 six-step planning process for developing a comprehensive school EOP. So the first content that we're going to look at is just basically best practice key planning principles that are foundational to developing a high-quality school EOP and for building capacity in preparedness. Incorporating these principles throughout the planning process and during the ongoing implementation of the EOP will increase the school's ability to carry out effective preparedness activities and will provide efficient responses to a variety of threats and hazards that your plan may address. So the first of these is planning should be supported by leadership. Leadership support offers ongoing support from campus and district levels. We know that leadership can provide that rare resource of time when we really need it to plan. And certainly these types of plans take lots and lots of time. Leadership support involves they're giving key guidance to the committee as they plan and do their assessments. They can assist with the alignment of the plan, both vertically from the district down, as well as horizontally across all facilities and campuses in the district. And they also offer a unique perspective that can benefit the planning committee through a different lens, broader perspective. They can certainly make sure that the procedures are in alignment with other district procedures that are already in place and policies. And also, just their support demonstrates commitment. By being actively involved in the committee, leadership support speaks volumes, of course, to others. So we definitely want them involved. Okay, next we have, assist with buy-in from staff and assimilation into the culture. Of course, you know, when leaderships speak to the importance of the plan, then obviously the staff will understand and follow and realize the importance as well. So obviously we want to use assessments to customize your EOP plan. You know, when it comes to EOPs, there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. Every school is unique. It's distinct. It has different characteristics, strengths, and different vulnerabilities. So numerous assessments might be used to identify risks and potential issues and available resources that you might use. These assessments make your plan comprehensive. It's obviously going to be an ongoing process. This is not a one-time, one-shot assessment. It'll be done over consistently over time. The data from these assessments, is gathered, and it's going to form the basis for your individualized EOP. Also, these assessments address your local response capability, the resources that you have, the skills that you already have. And of course, when you assess, you're going to find out what your gaps are in resources. What skills do you not have? What do you need to build into your plan with your community partners? We'll be discussing several different types of assessments later on in the presentation today. The next key planning principle is, of course, taking an all hazards approach. Now, our Texas Education Code, Chapter 37, the verbiage or the wording is multi-hazard. So you may hear us interchange those two, but in Texas, we like to say multi-hazard. That's what's written into the law. Comprehensive school EOPs must also consider all threats that might take place in a community and a surrounding area that could possibly impact the school. There are 4 different types of these hazards and threats. There's natural hazards and threats, technological, biological, and human-caused. This gives us a realistic and data-driven approach. They help us to consider when we're planning a broad spectrum of threats and hazards. It helps us to prioritize the likelihood of these occurring. And the multi-hazard approach is focused on safety needs before, during, and after a school incident. Also offers us a common language as we assess together and prioritize. We all understand which ones we want to include in our plan and operate from. The next key planning principle is providing for the whole community, whole being the key word there. Through every step in this planning process, the planning team should take an inclusive approach to make sure that the whole school community is represented and can participate. This includes staff, students, families, visitors on campus or in a district, any students and adults with disabilities, any and all individuals with access or functional needs. That could be, for example, communication or transportation needs. Individuals with various religious, cultural, racial, or ethnically diverse backgrounds should also be included. When we do this, it helps us to not only identify what the needs are, but we make sure that we're meeting the needs of our specific school population. You could have, as you know, 2 schools right down the street from one another, and their compositions are very, very different and unique. Again, providing for the whole school community means that we're meeting all of the needs of all of our stakeholders. The next key planning principle is considering all settings and times. School EOPs are often designed to cover students and staff's responses during the instructional school day. But obviously this is not enough. We've got to consider well beyond the instructional time frame. We need to think beyond that into a 24-hour period before, during, and after school. We also need to think about on and off campus settings when we are planning for our response actions. What about recess and lunch and between bells, class transitions, when students arrive on campus first thing in the morning, when they're standing around waiting for dismissal? We also need to consider every single day of the week. We're all aware of various tournaments and activities that go on well beyond Monday through Friday. So again, considering all times and settings means 24 hours every day of the week. Finally, and it's kind of understood at this point, but it absolutely must be a collaborative process. Developing a comprehensive plan like this is best done through the work of many. Obviously, the key stakeholders are going to be important who you invite to the table, but it's really going to be important that you plan together as a team. Don't plan in a vacuum. So we want to make sure that you are doing all parts together, creating, reviewing, and revising as a team. Make sure that you're working with your district staff, not just local school staff, and your community partners. Invite them to the table as well. Multiple perspectives give us a more comprehensive plan too. So the more you have around the table, the more variety of experiences you have to draw from, and that certainly can help you to create an even better, more effective plan. Okay, so the rest of this webinar is going to be basically going through the 6-step planning process. And we're going to focus on each of those 6 planning steps in the process. The planning principles are just meant to kind of weave themselves throughout the whole planning process. So those are like best practices that you'll hear us talk about as we talk through each of the steps when you're creating your plan. So our plan steps are, first, we're going to form a collaborative planning team. We're going to try to understand our situation with the use of lots of assessments. We're going to determine our goals and objectives that we want to have for our outcomes. We're going to actually develop our plan with all of the data that we pulled together from the assessments, and then we're going to create our courses of action. We're going to then put our plan together and prepare it. We're going to have it reviewed by multiple pairs of eyes and different lenses and stakeholders, and then we're going to have final approval and dissemination of the plan. And then finally, step 6 would be to implement the plan and maintain it. So again, it is a cyclical planning process. This is not something that you do one time and then you put it on the shelf. This is something that needs to be reviewed on an ongoing basis. And it is very much a living document. Things can change, structures can be built, so it's really important that this plan be revised and reviewed frequently. Okay, so let's jump off into the very first step. As I mentioned, it's about forming a collaborative planning team. The key to this is you want a group that's small enough to really allow good collaboration with your first responders, your community partners, and all, but you don't want it too large to where it's not functional. So the key would be to sit down and really think through, who do we need to invite to the table? What resources are we going to need to tap into? What advice and information are we going to need to access? So some of the suggested members, I'm just going to roll through a few of these. Certainly not anything required, but just something to consider. Your membership of this committee might include emergency management coordinators, superintendent or assistant soup, somebody from the finance department, definitely an IT person, someone from the facilities and support services division of your district, medical health and mental health workers are going to be key people as well. You're going to need counselors and social workers there to draw their experience and advice from. Also, someone from human resources, student services, certainly special programs. Also food services, transportation department, athletics, school-based law enforcement, board of trustees, and campus representatives, across the spectrum. When you think about your collaborative partners that are going to be there to support your committee, you might think about, of course, the local emergency management, first responders, law enforcement, fire, emergency medical services, depending on your access, local, state, and federal officials. Parent organizations are a really good resource. Local health authorities, community mental health organizations, and even public works or building inspectors. So you can see the broad spectrum of ideas and information that you can draw from this group of people. Okay, so the next part involves forming a common framework, and this is just simply speaking the same language. You have a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds coming together with one purpose. You want to make sure that your approach is using, of course, the required ICS incident command system through the NIMS. And of course, this is going to allow everyone to kind of follow in alignment with their steps. So throughout the process, members need to take time to learn one another's vocabulary. It's a learning process. You may have people who have done this for years, and you may have a few that don't know what you're talking about. So don't make assumptions and just walk through and make sure everybody's very clear about the purpose and the command system that's going to be involved. And of course, first responders, they all function within the ICS system. They can ensure that EOP is aligned with NIMS as well. Okay, next you're going to define and assign roles and responsibilities to the group members. Every person involved really needs to know what their role and their responsibility is. Some people, may be really good at supporting plan maintenance tasks or like conducting assessments, gathering data and reporting back, conducting threat and hazard assessments. Others might be better utilized to support like training efforts and implementation tasks. Organizing exercises, or maybe facilitating different technology components. So everybody needs to have a task and understand what their role is toward the whole committee. And of course, you need to determine a regular schedule of meetings. And I know that sounds so simple, but we all know how crazy the school year gets even before it started. And so it's really important that you set up as a team, your core team, to meet regularly. You may not have the entire committee meet every single time, but it is important that you meet on a regular basis. Everyone has agreed to that. That way you can continue to develop those partnerships and relationships with the first responders and the community members. Okay, so the next step, I think Tom is going to speak to.
Thank you, Laura. Now, step 2 involves understanding the situation. And so this is going to involve really understanding what all your hazards, your threats, what's going on in your community, and what needs to be addressed by your EOP. Generally, we break those down into three main types of hazards. The natural hazards, which might include something like, tornadoes, floods, things of that nature. The technological hazards, which could be a train derailment and power failure, a dam failure, failure of some kind of process or structure, and human-caused events. And those are usually, could be school violence, could be explosives, chemical or biological attacks, something that's actually caused by individuals. And when you're assessing your risks, you're going to need to make sure that you understand all of those different components in your area. Got behind on the slides here. So when you're assessing the risk, you'll usually do a site assessment. And site assessments also are included within your audit process. But when you're visiting the sites, you're going to be able to look at very specific functions and processes there in each one of those sites. Like you might look at your playgrounds, like the picture shows here, or chemistry labs, or your special event venues, and access to your facilities. All those can be viewed from doing a site assessment and looking and see how students move around, how the public comes to your facilities, how supplies are delivered, all sorts of things. But assessing those risks and making sure that you have a wide view of all the different types of hazards and threats and what risks they may pose throughout your campus. Another thing is your culture and climate. And so many of the different types of risks that you face will affect your culture and your climate of your school, which also greatly affects the quality of your educational environment. So you want to look very closely at behaviors of students and staff. Bullying, of course, is a huge issue. People that are threatening others. Other types of threats just from the community, which could even be in terms of something like traffic problems, hazardous material routes near your school. A number of things like that can have some impacts on how people feel about being in the location they are and their educational environment. So make sure things are tied back and you address issues related to climate and culture. It's a little harder to assess because oftentimes you can't physically see those things that affect your climate and culture, but it's a very important step in that process. And then you're going to evaluate your school threats, and this may come in a lot of different ways. You may want to look at some of your data and some of your documents and what kinds of activities are going on within your school and your community. But these are for your threats, the threats in your area, specific to a campus. I think Laura mentioned a little while ago that two campuses within the same district may be very, very different in terms of the hazards and threats. One might be located in the central part of town. Another new school might have been placed on the edge of town. Some might be near railroad tracks, some may not be. So they pose different levels of threats and hazards. So you want to make sure that you include process to identify that those are, what those threats are, and put processes together to assist in identifying people that need intervention for any kind of behavioral threats that they're providing, and you provide assistance to them. Hopefully, turn folks around so it doesn't become a further issue. Monitoring those individuals, being able to report, having a method by which all students in your community and within your schools have a way to anonymously report, and that those reports are taken seriously so you can address different types of threats. We're going to see a lot more in the development of threat assessment teams. So it's very, very important to make sure you have those processes in place for students to be able to report and discuss behaviors that they see, to be able to provide intervention. And you also need to look at your capacities. What is it that we can do? Look at our resources. First of all, our human resources are very important. Lots of times we've gone to trainings, even weapons of mass destruction training, where we get to see what it's like to be a first responder to violent incidents or even train derailments, things like that. Gives us better understanding of what it takes in the way of resources and capacity. So we need to monitor that both in qualified individuals by offering them training, providing the right equipment, even as something as simple as first aid kits and fire extinguishers and other equipment throughout the school. You need to have processes within your emergency operations plan that provide for restocking, reordering that equipment, maintaining that equipment, making sure everything is there. Resource inventory and typing. If you need a piece of equipment and your district doesn't have it, you may need to know where you could obtain that information. And then FEMA has a whole list and a whole program of typing different types of resources, so that if you need a dump truck, they're going to say, what kind of dump truck? You need something that just carries a couple of yards of material, or do you need an 18-wheeler that's a 14-yard, 20-yard dump truck, things like that, so you don't end up not getting what it is that you need. So having a resource inventory within the school would be a really important aspect that you can embark on to identify all the resources you have, the kinds of things that you might need, and where you could get those ahead of time. I don't think there's too many school districts that have a real good up-to-date resource inventory. However, a lot of municipalities do, and other governmental entities that list all the equipment that they have. And there are some school districts that have gone into that. So that may be something you want to consider, your resource inventories. Now, some of the job aids to help on those assessments, and a good example of them is the audit tools and audit toolkit. So again, we're going to walk you through just a little bit of how you might find those tools located on the website. So if you go to the Texas School Safety Center's website and you go to the tools section and click on those tools, in the example here, while we have many different toolkits available, this is an example of identifying the K-12 safety and security audit toolkit. You can go there. There's language there that'll walk you through, and where you can go through the text of the guidance materials, understanding it from that angle, or you can look at the table of contents. Each one of the table of contents here have an active link that you can hop to different sections of the guide or the resources, or you can go to the tab at the bottom where it's browse and download all job aids offered in this toolkit. So if you click on that, it would take you to a list of different tools within that toolkit. And you just have to look at each one. Most of them will be put in a PDF, and some may be an Excel spreadsheet where you can utilize. If you're looking for the actual audit checklist, down second to the bottom on this list, we'll show you the audit checklist that you can pull up, you can download, you could customize to your needs. Okay, so those will be one way that you can find some of those job aids that can help you in some of those assessments. Also, I'll mention here too, just if you're going to our website, there is a search feature. If you go to the little magnifying glass, you can put in some keywords and it'll usually provide you with a drop-down box as well. So if you're looking on the website trying to find different resources and get a little lost with it, sometimes that keyword search is real helpful. Now, once we've kind of looked at, we need to look at all of our hazards, and we're trying to identify which ones are most likely to occur. So here's a couple of examples. Let's say a fire, what are the probability of fire? Well, in most cases, we're really pretty well protected against fire, so it doesn't happen as often as you might think, but one of the reasons it doesn't is because we're so prepared for it, taking all those actions. So fire, that's kind of a broad term. You could say, a wildfire versus a fire within the facilities, they may be very different. But you could evaluate the probability of those kinds of things happening to your school and your district. And then what would happen if it did occur? Well, we know that there's lots of different levels, but what would a fire magnitude? It would usually be probably either pretty critical in terms of your operations. If you have any kind of a fire, you're going to have smoke and water damage, so it may cease some of your operations. Or let's say it was a small trash can fire, that may be very limited, or if it gets put out fast enough, it might be negligible. But looking at those types of hazards, putting that kind of context to those, helps you to be able to plan and develop your emergency operations plan. What kind of warning do you need for something like a fire? Usually that's a very quick ability to get in and out. It's not a long duration warning. Now, the duration of the actual event could vary quite a bit. So it gives you a few ideas on how you can evaluate some of those hazards. And then the priority is whether that would be a high priority, medium, or low. It doesn't mean you wouldn't respond to it. Obviously, a fire is going to be something that almost always is going to be a high priority. And then hazardous material spill or any other. There's a long list of those kind of issues. But this is where we begin to understand the context, how likely, magnitude, warning time, and durations. And then if you want to compare and prioritize all of your hazards that are listed, you're going to identify those threats and hazards, understand their impact, assign priorities to it. Next week's webinar, we will get into a little bit more of a THIRA, which is the Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. The idea there is to identify your threats and hazards, and if they're high priority and high consequence, trying to work through a risk assessment to bring some of those down so that they're not as immediate a priority. Work to mitigate some of those hazards. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to Laura for a little bit. She's going to go through some of the next steps.
Okay, so step 3 is determining your goals and objectives. So after you have identified, you can prioritize your threats and hazards. You definitely want to make sure that you consider the before, during, and after approach when you're developing goals and objectives. So here on the screen, you can see just an example. Like they selected, fire hazard here. So when you think about your before, during, and after, you're going to establish a goal for each of those time frames. So again, before, the goal would be, preventing a fire from occurring on school grounds. During that event, if it were to happen, what is your priority there? Well, we're going to protect students and staff from injury by, fire or smoke. After this incident, your goal could be to reestablish the learning environment. Of course it will be. So for each of these goals, which are going to be before, during, and after, it's suggested that you really develop at least one objective, typically more than one. And keeping in mind that a goal is just a broad statement that indicates what you want to have happen. That's your desired outcome in response to a threat. Now, your objectives are specific, measurable actions to take or achieve the goal. So again, considering before, during, and after the incident, and then your objectives based with your goals. Okay, so once the team has identified the goals and objectives for each of the selected threats and hazards, you're going to find that there are certain common critical functions or cross-cutting functions that apply to across several different emergencies. In this particular example, as you can see in the middle with the red boxes, evacuate. The function of accountability, finding all of your stakeholders, individuals in an incident after you evacuated, addressing medical needs. So these are common functions that are going to pop up across other threats and hazards that you are working on identifying and creating your goals and objectives. So basically these functions are going to end up in your functional annex section of your EOP. So again, eventually you will establish goals and objectives for those functions as well. But I want to point out that we do have a specific webinar that the content is dedicated to functional and hazard specific annexes. And that will be coming up in a few weeks. So we're not going to go too far into that, but just to let you know, that's where that evolves from, those common functions that are across all of your hazards and incidents that you identify. That's where those come from.
All right, moving into step 4, plan development. This is where you're going to identify your courses of action. And in the picture here, it gives you a little bit of a scenario here of a tanker truck rolling over, which obviously could bring to mind, a potential hazardous material spill, which could create an airborne hazard, or even if there's not anything in there that is leaking or exposing, you at least probably have diesel fuel and some oil leaks and things like that associated with it. So, in a scenario like this, you want to make sure that you've identified what your courses of action are, what resources you need. How are you going to make announcements? How is it going to be affected? How are you going to receive announcements? This may be something that is a couple blocks from your school or further away, how would you receive those notifications? Have you worked with your local fire department, police department, and other responders so that you get timely notification? And then what actions are you going to take for this? Making sure that they fit your protocol that you develop within your school. Usually for a hazardous material spill, the initial thought may be to shelter in place if you're not sure whether or not you have a hazardous material spill that might be detrimental. You would want to go into that usually before you would evacuate in case there is something airborne through that incident. However, you should always be prepared for a follow-up, which might be shelter in place initially till you hear more about it, then actually move toward evacuation. But remembering all your processes for sheltering, shutting down your HVAC systems, keeping people indoors, preserving the good air in until you're sure of your situation. But then being prepared for all your possible future evacuations. And in something like this, if you actually evacuated your facility, likely you're going to evacuate to an off-site location, and then now you have reunification that is going to play a role. And you may need to start planning for that and starting those actions for reunification almost immediately upon understanding what your situation is. So this whole part, step 4 of identifying your courses of action, are huge, because this is for every hazard you have identified. So in your multi-hazard or all-hazard plan, you're going to have all these different possible scenarios that can happen and identify those plans. So this is one of the parts that's going to take you a lot of time. Then within it, some of the identifications, courses of action are, notifying all the students and parents and the community, announcements, any kind of messages. Sometimes we always think of all the high tech, but we need some low tech options too in the event that some of the electronic communications don't work. Providing that immediate medical support, sealing rooms, like I said before, for the process of trying to retain that good air, and that may involve turning off your HVAC systems within, minutes. The reason I say 3 minutes is that's kind of a normal process to go through. So 3 minutes may or may not be the right length of time for your group. Some of you may have off-site controls for all your heating and air conditioning. That may take a little longer. So be aware of all those things and write those into your plan. Keep those in mind so that when you're putting together your emergency operations plan, you'll know how those fit into everything. And there's key questions. There's lots of questions that are going to come up to identify, your actions. What actions are needed? Who's responsible? So everyone's going to have a role. There's literally a role for everyone in the school. Not everyone's going to have the same role. They may have very differing roles, but everyone has to know what that is and be trained in it. When does it happen? How long does the action take place? How much time is actually available? Every event may have different scenarios. We know that a violent incident like a school shooting, the incident itself, the actual shooting and the taking of lives or injuries usually lasts a very short period of time, but it can be a very, very long extended operation depending on any injuries and crime scene and all those. So it's very important that you look at all these different key questions, and they're going to be different for each group and each of your EOPs. You make sure that you identify all those courses of action and the different that are effective or essential to your school and your plan. And remember always to tag whatever resources are needed to be able to get those accomplished. So this is very individual by district and by school. So one of the ways you can help identify whether you have some of those procedures covered is, again, to use an assessment tool, identify some of those gaps and weaknesses. And one of those is available, again, on our toolkit by looking up the Texas Unified School Safety and Security Standards. And when you click on tools, you can find the different toolkits. Go down to the School Safety and Security Standard. And again, you can read about the standard. You can also pick each one of the different sections, like under here, under section 2.2, we show, like mitigation, preparedness standards, you can just click on that and get actually the specific standards and the citations requiring those standards for mitigation, for the preparedness for that portion of the Texas Unified School Safety and Security Standards. You can also click to be able to get to the actual standard document itself, which is a PDF. Again, these address the 4 phases of emergency management as listed in law. So it's very important that you weave all 4 of those emergency operations phases into your plan. You know, as you can see from some of the requirements in the audit reporting and even some of the things that our local officials are demanding compliance to, is to make certain that those are all covered. So using those Texas Unified School Safety and Security Standards, it can give you the broad understanding of what needs to be included in those plans, and then you can add your specific tactics and procedures within it. Okay, now that's again a picture of what the standards look like. Make sure that all those are addressed somewhere within your EOP. This is an ongoing process. You're going to have all 4 phases, and there's a number of different standards within each of those phases. All right, I'm going to pass this over to Laura again.
Okay, step 5 obviously is the plan preparation, review, and approval step, and the planning team is going to take all the work and the content that it's created and assembled together up to this point, and it's going to prepare a draft of the EOP. On the slide, you'll see some just general best practice tips for writing your school EOP. Make sure that you write clearly using plain language. You want to make sure that you summarize what's important with checklists and visuals. Obviously, nobody really spends a lot of time reading hundreds of pages of just text. So when you can, visuals are a great way to provide the same information in a much more easily comprehensible format. Logical, consistent structure, provide enough detail to convey what needs to be understood, but without being too wordy. And then make sure that you develop accessible tools and documents. Okay, so the basic plan itself, the traditional format, has 3 major sections. The basic plan, which gives us an overview of the school and district's actions and their approach to emergency operations. Then you have the functional annexes, and then the threat and hazard specific annexes. So I want to mention again, in a few weeks, we have a specific webinar that's dedicated to the functional and threat and hazard specific annexes. We also have a very specific webinar planned in the next few weeks for going through in detail the basic plan components. So at this point, we're not going to address all of the details there, but I just want to kind of show you. These are just typical. There's no one size fits all. There are some overlapping verbiage, but just some general standard sections that you see in a plan. Basically, again, the basic plan just gives an overview of how the school and the district is going to respond. Okay. Then you come to the functional annex portion, and this is just going to explain how the common cross-cutting essential functions are going to be managed before, during, and after an incident. And then third section would be the threat and hazard specific annexes. I mean, once again, this is going to vary from district to district, from school to school. So if these are threats and hazards that were specifically identified through your assessments, then these would be things that you might see in this annex for your district. Okay, so the final part of this step would be, to review, approve, and share. So once everybody has drafted the plan, it's really important to have a broad spectrum of stakeholders review it. You want lots of pair of eyes on this document. Common sense tells you that, but we want to make sure that your plan is actionable. Something might seem doable on paper, but in actuality, a staff member could read it and think there's no way. So it's really important to have multiple stakeholders review and go through it and make sure that it's very clear and understandable and actionable. Once that's taken place and it's finalized, it is certainly submitted for approval to the board and the superintendent. Appropriate signatures are gained on the document itself. Of course, it's submitted to community members and stakeholders as well. And you're going to be ready to share out the plan. It's really important when you get ready to share this document to maintain a record of the people and the organizations that receive a copy of this plan. Committees should also decide which parts should be shared and which parts should not be shared for confidentiality considerations. It's really important. Which parts should we redact and so forth. Who should get a copy of this plan? Well, that's up to you, but I mean, certainly community partners, first responders, local emergency management, all involved stakeholders should have a copy of it or have access to a copy. Don't forget organizations that use the facilities in your district. After school programs, summer school programs, those individuals will need access to this plan as well.
Thanks, Laura. On step 6, we're going to talk a little bit about plan implementation and maintenance. Now, everyone has to be trained on their roles. And like I said earlier, everyone has a role in the emergency operations plan to some extent, whether it's just, it may be supervision of students, it may be helping to facilitate some of the other actions, but everybody has a role and everyone needs to be trained on that role, understand what that is. So make sure that your training and your resources are very extensive, that you actually, let me go back a little bit too and look at the individual things, whether you hold a meeting, which that is one way that you can get some of the materials distributed, but you can also distribute them on paper. A lot of other, most schools are very good about sending out your emergency operations plans and notes or flip charts or something else to be a reference to your different activities. Visiting all those key locations, it's important that when you're developing that emergency operations plan, you actually look at those locations and make sure that what they look like so that you're not missing things when you're setting up that plan. Making sure that we're teaching all those roles and responsibilities of everyone. We don't want custodians retreating to their closet to hang out until a fire drill is passed. They need to have a role in assisting to get people out of the building and things like that. And also the fire marshal could certainly fine individuals for not following those drill procedures. But including your community partners, the last thing you would want is someone not understanding the emergency procedures and only finding them out once law enforcement or they arrive as a responder, like the fire department. You want to make sure that they know what to expect and you're doing the kinds of things that they expect. But one of the biggest components we're going to have is drills and exercises. And we can't emphasize this enough. And it is part of the plan implementation and definitely part of the maintenance, because your plan will evolve a lot based on your after-action reviews and results from your drills and exercises. And just to make sure that everybody knows a little bit of the difference of them, drills are what you're normally doing probably most often. You're conducting fire drills and lockdown drills, lockout drills perhaps, evacuation drills, shelter in place or sheltering for a hazmat spill or for severe weather. Those kinds of drills are held very often. In addition to drills are a whole level of exercises. And some of the less intricate levels of drills are tabletop exercises where you can propose scenarios to your staff, students, and other specific functions within the school to evaluate what you would do in a certain situation. And it really helps you to learn more about what your procedures are and what kinds of things you may have not planned for. In addition to tabletop exercises, then it might move into a functional exercise. You might be doing just one function. Maybe it's an active shooter, but it may just be a function. It may be just the police department responding. You might be doing it from a classroom standpoint. You may put all those together, or you may put several of those pieces together. Those are usually considered a functional exercise. Then you could have a full-scale exercise. The full-scale exercises are the things that only come about maybe once a year or every few years. It may take you a whole year to plan, and that would involve everybody in your community, all those different resource pieces that may have to come together in an event. Something like Hurricane Harvey, you can see all the people that were mobilized. A full-scale exercise would touch everybody from your local responders to potentially National Guard and transportation issues, Parks and Wildlife, a number of different folks. You may have your helicopters landing, all these kinds of things. So it goes into full-scale exercise. To go a little further on drills, one of the things we want to make sure you remember is your emergency operations plan must address the drills as mandated by your district. So part of your emergency operations plan should be the inclusion of which drills you're doing, where you're doing them, how often you're doing them. For instance, if you're at the high school, you're going to do a fire drill every month that school's in session 10 or more days. Let's say for a lockdown, your district may say, well, we're going to do at least one a semester. You might have more than that. You may say, look, we're going to do 4 a semester, 2 each semester, or one, one during the summer. Think about what those requirements are. Now, your transportation facility may have a little different structure than that. You may not be doing monthly fire drills because the fire code may allow you not to do them so often because there's not students present. It's not really an educational use. But you're going to have to decide that as a district. The number of drills you do may, in some of your support facilities, may not match what you're doing in the instructional facilities that you have on campus. But someplace you should have that list of your mandated drills, and that list of your drills then becomes what the state is going to look to as being a mandate. At least that's the way it's under current law is interpreted. So make sure you have those lists, you're following those, because that's the true place of meeting those mandates, is meeting your mandated drills. One good comment that came in already about that, we want to talk a little bit more about, fire drills in general as well as some others. We get pretty complacent about doing the same drills all the time. If we go out to a school and we ask somebody, what drill do you do best? They'll always say fire evacuation drill. They do that best. But they've gotten so routine that oftentimes all you're trying to do is maybe beat the previous time or be within an acceptable time frame. And you're really not looking at other things like, are you using a secondary exit because you're conducting an obstructed fire drill? Try that. That's something it is really required that you do, is do at least one obstructed fire drill, so that if everyone's used to going down stairway A, all of a sudden stairway A is not available because that's where the fire is, forcing them to realize what their secondary route is and where they go. That could be saving lives by making sure that you've practiced that as well. And then in conjunction with other drills, like a lockdown drill. We saw that as an illustration in the Florida shooting. If someone pulls a fire alarm or even puts a smoke bomb in the hallway to draw people out, but you're actually in a lockdown because of someone shooting, you're going to have to readjust your thinking and probably not respond to that fire drill unless that fire alarm, unless you're absolutely certain that that is the best response at that time. If you possibly could be injured or shot getting out because of a fake fire alarm, then obviously that would have been the wrong choice. So we need to stay in lockdown unless we're absolutely certain that fire situation is affecting you to the point that you could lose your life that way. So we have to think outside the box. I know it's really easy to say if A happens, then we do B, but a lot of this is going to be determined by your environment. So your environment is going to dictate your tactics. What you do is going to be dependent on what is going on, what your intelligence is at that point, what you've heard down the hallway or other locations. So we have to practice those in different locations, practice those drills at different times. I know nobody is going to pull a fire drill or a lockdown drill during lunch while kids are eating. There are rules about going back into the cafeteria and having to remake meals and all that. However, you can simulate that. What would you do if that happens? What about before school? What about when everyone's in the hallway? We all tend to practice our drills at times from a classroom, and that isn't necessarily when something bad is going to come down. So we have to be prepared for all those other options. So please, about all the things you do, making sure that your tactics, your drills are designed in a certain manner that you're going to encompass all those different hazards. You're going to practice those. You're going to conduct an after-action review. You're going to find out what works and what doesn't work, and utilize that in the development and the updating of your emergency operations plan. It is crucial that those kind of things happen. Now I accuse Laura of putting her laundry picture in on this one, but the idea is this always has to be maintained. So, it's something that happens over and over and over again. So as soon as you get done with it, you've planned, then you're going to review and you're going to update, you're going to correct and make changes, you're going to distribute those changes, you're going to drill and exercise those plans, and then you're going to do it all over again. So it never is going to go away. You're going to keep going. One other question that came in kind of related to our drills that we'll touch on while we're here is, it said who decides the list of mandated drills? Again, that's your district. The law says your emergency operations plan must include drills, mandated drills. Then you go further into Chapter 37-108 in Texas Education Code, and it talks about drills as mandated by the plan. The plan is your emergency operations plan. So a district can decide, other than probably fire drills. Fire drills are the one that is pretty universal. Everybody in a school educational usage building has got to conduct that fire drill once a month, on any month that school's in session 10 or more days. So other than that, the other drills need to be determined by the district. There are some districts in the state of Texas where tornadoes are very, very rare. And so they may not conduct tornado drills nearly as often. Somebody up in another part of the state, which has them all the time, has a greater need for being able to respond to those. So they may have more. So it's always been left up to the district as far as which drills they're doing and how frequently. I wouldn't doubt that in the near future, the legislature may turn around and start requiring different drills, a different frequency. There was previously a list of drills in Texas Education Code 37.1081, but that was directly related to a certification program that has expired and is no longer in that statute and no longer required. And to clarify, the certification program itself was not required. The list of drills to do within that certification, to get that certification, there was a list of 5 drills that you would have to do at least once a year, but that is no longer in law. So the district has the ability to determine your own drills and frequency, although trust me, the media does not understand that, and they will try to compare one district to another. That is just one of those things we'll have to keep working on, but I would not be surprised in future legislative sessions that something comes down that will require a certain, at least minimum number. Currently, the School Safety Center recommends drills. We recommend a minimum of 2 of every type of drill other than your fire drill, which has to be done monthly. So hopefully that helps to clarify a little of that. But one of the things you can do the most good in your plan is constantly monitoring your drills, conducting those exercises, making sure your EOP contains all the current, correct information that's well thought out, and making adjustments. Things that we know today changed our EOPs drastically over what they were 10 or 15 years ago. So continue to look at that. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Tom and Laura, for the great information that you all shared. That's a lot of information. At this time, I do encourage you to please place any of the questions that you may have for Tom and or Laura, and they will be happy to address any questions. We did have a couple of them that came in, so I know that Tom will be addressing the first one or the second one. So again, feel free to please put the questions in the chat box.
We had a question that wanted to elaborate a little bit more on what an obstructed fire drill is. Every fire exit route that you have for a classroom, for a room within the school, you should have more than one exit identified. Now, maybe you only have one door to your classroom, so it's obvious that there's only one way out of of some classrooms. But once you get outside that classroom, there may be more than one method of egress you can get out of. One may be turning right down the hallway and down stairway A, and the other one may be to turn the other direction and go all the way down the other end of the hall to stairway B. Things like that. You have a primary and a secondary evacuation route determined, and it should be listed on your evacuation maps. So if almost always that stairway A is the closest one for you to go. Every fire drill you do the same thing. What would happen if one day you went down that stairwell and that's where the fire, that's where, whatever incident is happening, that's where it's happening. And you can't go that direction. If you're just stuck because you don't know where else to go, you'll have a lot of chaos, and that could end to a very bad outcome, just not knowing where that is. So conducting an obstructed drill would be you tape it off. We've actually got a large cardboard cutout of flames that actually stands up. We could put it at the base of a stairway, and all it says in the front of it is, "What now?" And it just gets you to think, "Uh-oh, can't go that way." Or just put some tape there, or put a person there and say, "No, you can't go this way. Go to your secondary route." That will help you test that secondary route exit. And the thought is that you should do, of your fire drills, you should do at least one obstructed fire drill annually. I would suggest trying to do it more often than that, at least one every semester. We break it up into semesters for a number of reasons, but that's always a time that you can get some new teachers, you could get some new staff, you can get some transfers of students, people that don't know the other procedures, they haven't been there before. But that's what an obstructed fire drill is. You need to know other ways out. Just like you would in a lockdown, your primary objective may be to lock those doors and get out of sight, turn out those lights, and remain silent. However, if that door is being breached, all of a sudden you've got some other things that you need to be considering. Do you need to barricade that door? Can you get out a window? So there's other things for you to always think about. Don't get too complacent about doing the same thing all the time. Be able to adjust your responses. And so that obstructed fire drill or something like that is just a way of reminding people that you've got to keep in mind other directions and other actions that need to be taken. If there's any other questions too, please go ahead and send those. I'm going to turn it over to CJ again here to say a little bit.
Okay. Thank you, Tom and Laura. One of the things that we're going to do is we're going to follow up after this webinar with an evaluation. The only way that we're going to be able to improve and enhance what we do here at the center is for you to complete an evaluation and let us know your feedback. What are your thoughts? What are your comments that you may have? It's a very simple evaluation. And the good thing is, upon completion of the evaluation, we're going to provide the handouts and the materials that Tom and Laura prepared for this particular webinar. And in addition to the materials, you'll also be provided the link for the webinar. So we are recording this webinar, which will be featured in our Texas School Safety Center webinar archive YouTube page that we have. And you'll be able to view it at your leisure. If there's something that you might have missed and you want to go back, you can definitely do so by viewing it. At this time, I don't see any other questions coming in, so I'm going to turn it on over to Laura.
Okay, just a quick reminder, next week, if you've already registered, we do have a webinar specifically focusing on conducting a THIRA. And so we're going to be looking at that step 2 in the planning process in much greater detail, and hopefully answering some more questions that may pop up in your mind as you're reviewing the materials and today's content. So next week, conducting a THIRA, and there's our contact information. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or call Tom or I. We are here to support you and help you, and we will do what we can to answer any questions that you may have. So don't hesitate. Again, just give us a call or email. All right, thank you.